Last week we looked at a lesson on a miracle that took place in the life of Jesus in John chapter 5. If you were with us in that study, you might recall that there was a man who was lame for 38 years who was healed by Jesus when he simply said, "Arise, take up thy bed and walk." Part of the great controversy surrounding that miracle, at least in the minds of the Jews, was the day on which Jesus performed it. We read there that it was performed upon the Sabbath day. And I may mention last week, I wasn't going to spend any time on that because I'd planned for this week to look at a study that revolves around that idea. It's actually based upon this miracle and two other miracles that we're going to be reading about that took place in Mark chapter 2. If you have your Bibles, you can turn over there. We're going to look at the end of the chapter there and read about one of those miracles. And then in Mark chapter 3, we actually read about another one. And all these three miracles, one of the common themes that they have is the day on which they were performed. And as we read and study them, what we find out is Jesus did these things on the Sabbath day. Now, I'll mention that these are not the only miracles that Jesus ever performed on the Sabbath day. It just so happens they're kind of bunched together here, and so we're going to kind of look at them under this heading. But if you remember in John chapter 5 and verse 16, that miracle that we studied last week, at least last Sunday morning, it ended with this statement in verse 16. It says, "And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him because he had done these things on the Sabbath day." So we're thinking about these Jews, these Pharisees are seeking to destroy Christ because of this miracle or this action, or as they would call it, this work that he did upon the Sabbath day. And as we go through this study, I think what we're going to find, if we didn't already know it, is we're going to see that the Jews held the Sabbath in a very high regard. If you're not familiar with what the Sabbath is, the Sabbath day was simply the seventh day of the week for the Jew. God had set aside that day, and he had deemed in that day there was no work to be done. And so it had become something that in the minds of the Jews was very sacred, very special to them. We'll talk about some of the reasons why that is as we go along. But if you have your Bibles in Mark chapter 2, and I invite you to begin, we're going to start in verse 23. And the first thing that we're going to look at is the conflict about the Sabbath day. Mark records that it came to pass that he, that is Jesus, went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day. And his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn. And the Pharisees said unto him, "Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful?" Now, I want to emphasize that if the actions that took place on this day, if they had taken place on any other day of the week, there wouldn't even have been a conversation. There wouldn't have been a discussion. There wouldn't be a conflict in any way. But as we just read back in John chapter 5, there's a plot that is thickening against Jesus, and that is the plot to destroy him. And so there's a controversy that's going to rage on and on and on, that Jesus is violating the law of Moses, that he's working on the Sabbath day. And so what happens? Well, we read about Jesus and his disciples as they're traveling. They are hungry, and they simply stop and get something to eat. Now, I've mentioned in a lot of these stories that we're looking at that you can find the parallel accounts of them in the other gospel accounts. And this is one of those where if you look, there's actually two parallels. There's one in the book of Luke, and there's also one in Matthew. And I'm going to refer to them as we go throughout this study from time to time. But what Luke tells us in Luke chapter 6 and verse 1 is that his disciples plucked the ears of corn, and they did eat. And then he mentions this detail. He says, rubbing them in their hands. Now, there's a couple of things I want to point out. Number one, the Greek word that is translated into the English as corn in the King James Version, it literally means grain. And so when you think about plucking an ear of corn, if you're going to eat that ear of corn, would you take it and rub it in your hands? Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us, does it? But if it was wheat, you would. You would pluck the head of the wheat. You would take that wheat, you would rub it in your hands. That would separate the kernel from the chaff. You could blow the chaff off, and then you could eat the kernels. And so that's exactly what Jesus' disciples were doing here. Now, can you imagine this in your own mind here? We've read about this the Jews are trying to destroy Jesus because of the Sabbath, they're constantly spying on Christ. Where are these guys? I mean, can you imagine in your minds, are they hiding behind every grain stalk, looking to see Jesus do something? Are they hiding behind every corner, spying upon him and his disciples? The answer is yes. And so they're out here spying on Jesus and his disciples, and basically, whenever the disciples eat this grain, they jump out and they say, "Gotcha. We've caught you red-handed here. You're doing what it is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." And I want you to think about a couple of things here as we're talking about the Jews and why they had such a high regard for the Sabbath. The first thing that I want to emphasize that the Scripture teaches is that the Sabbath was only given to the community of Israel. That is, to the children of Israel. It wasn't something that every nation had. In fact, you can read back in Nehemiah 9 and verse 4, and there's a number of passages in the Old Testament about the Sabbath. But the statement is made there, "Thou madest known unto them thy holy Sabbath, and commandest them thy precepts, statutes, and laws." Notice when it was made known, when it was commanded, "by the hand of thy servant Moses." Some people have this idea that the Sabbath began back in Genesis chapter 2 when God rested from creating. But actually the Bible teaches us God didn't establish the Sabbath. He didn't command the Sabbath until it was through Moses. And so Moses was the giver of the law of Moses. We know that. He was the leader of the children of Israel. And so that's when the Sabbath was given and established. What did he do? Well, he gave them a day that reminded them of rest. Now, this is important because I don't have time this morning to go back through all the Old Testament. That's one of the challenges of this study, is trying to condense everything into a shorter talk that actually makes sense. A lot of times you can include all the information and say, "Well, is that all about?" But if you go back and you'll study a little bit of the history behind the Sabbath, what was the purpose? Why? And the answer is, it was to remind them of what God did for them in Egypt. Now remember that in Egypt, they worked nonstop every day for hundreds of years. And so when God brought them up out of Egypt, He gives them a new law. He gives them some things to remind them of why they did what they did. And in part, it was things that reminded them of what God had done for them by bringing them up out of Egypt. And so this is one of those things. God gave them a day to remind them of what He had done for them. And that day, they were to rest. They were to stop working, not work, not do anything. And it was a reminder of what He had done for them when He brought them up out of Egypt. Now, who was it given to? Now, again, I want to emphasize it was given only to the children of Israel, right? He says in Exodus 31 and verse 13, He says, "Speak thou unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbath shall ye keep, for it is a sign," notice this, "between me and you throughout your generation." In verse 17, he says, "It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever." The Sabbath day was a special sign between God and the children of Israel. It was never given to any other nation. And the reason it wasn't given to any other nation is because God didn't bring them up out of a place where they had worked nonstop 7 days a week for hundreds of years. And so God established this special sign, this special covenant with them. He didn't give it to any other nation. Now I want you to stop and think about that. What would be the significance of that if this was like God to Americans today? If God established this special sign with Americans and He didn't do it with any other nation, would you feel a little bit proud about that? I mean, in your mind, would you say, this is very special to us? This is very important to us. And so that's kind of the mindset, I think, that the Jews developed about the Sabbath day. And they should have. They took it very seriously. They considered it very sacred, very special to them. What was the Sabbath all about? Well, the Sabbath was all about abstaining from chores or from work. That's what the purpose of the Sabbath was. If you go back to Exodus chapter 20 and verses 8 through 10, now remember these are the 10 commandments in Exodus chapter 20. In verse 8, one of the commandments was, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. Think about the importance. How important was this commandment to Israel and to God? Well, it was one of the 10 commandments, wasn't it? It ranks right up there with thou shalt have no other gods before me. It ranks right up there with thou shalt not kill or commit murder. So it was a very important commandment to God and to Israel. And I think that is further illustrated in looking at the penalty for breaking. Do you know what the penalty was for breaking the Sabbath law? It was death, wasn't it? And so it was a very serious commandment that was given to the children of Israel. But what was it all about? It was all about not working. And that's what I want to emphasize to you. I'm not going to read all these verses that I have listed up here. I just want to mention what they're about and to emphasize to you, it was about not working. Okay, it wasn't about a guy walking and all of a sudden there was a rock in his way and he kicked that rock and got it out of his way. And then somebody said, oh, you violated the Sabbath day, right? Because you did some work right there. And everybody knows you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath day. That's not what was being spoken about. That was not even the purpose of the Sabbath day. It was all about working. And so if you read in Exodus 35, 2 through 3, the Holy Sabbath was to be a day of rest. Whosoever doeth work therein shall be put to death. And you know what one of the commandments was surrounding it? Ye shall kindle no fire. Okay, so you weren't supposed to build a fire. Now, did that apply in each and every instance, or is it talking about a working fire? You know, what happens if you were cold and you were going to freeze to death? Could you build a fire then? Or is it talking about building a fire for the purpose of working? You see what the emphasis is? You see the difference between the two? It was the idea of working. If you go in Numbers 15 verse 32, we read about a man who openly violated the Sabbath. Do you remember what he did on that day? The King James Version says they found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day. Now, when I think about gathering sticks, I think about walking around my yard. You know, I don't even do that. I just mow over them. I think about walking around the yard, you know, picking up this little stick here, picking up this little stick here. What if I translated it this way? Cutting wood. Okay, because that's what he was doing. He wasn't out here cleaning up his yard. You know, he wasn't out here moving a stick or two. He was out here gathering wood for the purpose of working. And so he violated the Sabbath day. There was no load that was supposed to be brought upon the Sabbath day. In Jeremiah 17 and verse 21, they weren't supposed to carry a load, that is for the purpose of working, out of their house. They weren't supposed to take that load somewhere else for the purpose of working. In Nehemiah 13 and verse 19, when Nehemiah came back to restore the law, one of the things that he did to shut down working on the Sabbath day, he closed the gates of Jerusalem. So nobody could bring anything in to sell and nobody could take anything out that they had bought. And so it revolved around the idea of working. Nehemiah 10 and verse 31, they were not supposed to sell on the Sabbath day. They were not supposed to buy. Again, the idea of working. In chapter 13 and verse 15, they weren't supposed to tread out wine presses on the Sabbath day. They weren't supposed to bring in sheaves. They weren't supposed to load up their donkeys. And so I emphasize all that to emphasize to you, this law was about not working. That's what it was about. Now, we just read a sample size of some of the things that were mentioned scripturally. You know, some of the things that the law of God commanded or demanded upon this day that revolved around the idea of working. But you have to understand this. Jewish tradition picked up where the law left off. Okay, God had all these rules and regulations about what you could do, what you could not do on the Sabbath day. And then the Jews said, well, we need to clarify some things a little bit further. And so here we're going to add our traditions and we're going to add our interpretations to these laws as to what a person can and cannot do. It's kind of interesting when you look back historically, there were 39 acts that were strictly forbidden on the Sabbath day by the tradition of the Jews. I'll just mention two very briefly, and I hope you can from them you can see the extremes to which they carried this law. One of them was spitting on the ground. And you might think, well, why would they forbid spitting on the ground? They said because if you spit on the ground, there's a chance that you'd take your sandal and you'd rub your foot over that spit and you'd roll up a ball of dirt, and everybody knows that's plowing, right? So you don't work on the Sabbath day. The second one was they forbid looking in a mirror, because they were afraid that if a person looked in the mirror, especially a woman, if she looked in the mirror and she saw a hair that was out of place and she plucked it, well, that's working on the Sabbath day. So you can see the extremes to which they had carried this law, when the law is very simple. It's just not about laboring and working on that day. It's about using that day to rest and remember what God had done for them. So there was tremendous conflict that revolved around the Sabbath day. Let's talk about some considerations about the Sabbath. You know, they accused Jesus and his disciples of doing something that was unlawful on the Sabbath day. So Jesus uses two examples to counter what they had said, and they're scriptural examples. The first one that you'll read about is found in Mark chapter 2. He talks about how David consumed the showbread. And I'm going to emphasize this to you because this is something I think that sometimes goes unnoticed about this story. On the Sabbath day. Okay? So you read about, Jesus talks about, look in verse 25. He asks them this question. He says, have you never read what David did when he had need and was an hungered, he and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and to eat the showbread which is not lawful to eat before the priest, and gave also to them which were with him. So Jesus basically goes back to this great figure in the Jewish history. Everybody loved David. Everybody was banking upon David. And he said, let me ask you a question about this man that you admire and respect so much. Did he break the law or not? Okay, and here's the story. He says he goes into the tabernacle and he eats the showbread. Now, a little bit of history behind the showbread. The showbread was, of course, located inside the tabernacle. It was part of what was used in establishing and setting up worship to God. You'll find this commandment back in Leviticus 24 and verses 8 and 9. Every Sabbath day, that bread was to be changed out. There were 12 loaves that were to be baked. It represented the 12 tribes of Israel. It sat on top of the altar. It stayed there for a week. And then every Sabbath day, that old bread would be taken out. New bread would be prepared, and it would be placed upon that table. If you read in Leviticus 24 and verse 9, here's the kicker about this bread. What do you do with this bread when you take it off the table? You just throw it in the trash? You just hand it out? No, the Bible says it is holy, it is sacred. And it is only to be eaten by Aaron and his sons. Those were the only people, according to the law of God, that were authorized to eat this bread. So it was a holy, it was a very special, very sacred thing. Now, if you read the story of that Jesus references of David in 1 Samuel 21, I'm not going to read that, but you can look at it if you're not familiar with it when you go home today. In 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 3 through 6, I'm not going to talk about David's pretense and all the things behind it. Basically, David shows up on the scene at the tabernacle. He says, I need something to eat. Well, do you have anything that you can give me? Specifically, he says, we need 5 loaves. He and some of his men were with him. They're actually running from Saul. They were running for their lives. But they were in a difficult situation. They didn't have any food. They didn't have anything to eat. So he shows up. He says, we need something to eat. Can you guys spare 5 loaves of bread? You know what the priest says to David? Only bread we've got here is holy bread. And you and I both know it's not right for a common person to eat this holy bread. Remember, the only person that could eat it were Aaron and his descendants, the priests. David was not one of those, neither were his men. But David talks to him a little bit, and the priest says, well, have you guys been behaving holy? Have you been keeping yourselves pure? And David said, yeah, we have. And David goes on to say also in 1 Samuel 21, this bread is in a manner common. It's not like we're taking it off the altar. It's already been changed, which indicates that very day is when the change took place, the Sabbath day. David is here. He said it's now common, and you put hot bread on the table. So in essence, it's not really, strictly holy like we would think of it, because it's still being used in service to the Lord. Well, long story short, if that's possible at this point, Jesus says this. He said, David did that which it was not lawful to do. True or false? And you know what day he did it on? The Sabbath day. So let me ask you a question. Was it unlawful for him to eat of that bread? Or was there this underlying principle that overruled that law? You know what the underlying principle was? David was dying if he did not eat something. And so if David and his men are going to stay alive, they've got to get something to eat. Well, we know the law says you can't eat this bread. What about in this instance? Is there an exception? Yes. David did something which it was not lawful to do, and of all days, he did it on the most holy day of the week, the Sabbath day. And so he uses that illustration first and foremost. The second one that he talks about is the idea that the priest counteracted the Sabbath laws. Now, you won't find that in Mark, but I mentioned there are parallel accounts of this story. If you go over to Matthew chapter 12 and verse 5, this is the second thing that Jesus says to them. He says, "Or have ye not read in the law, how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath, and are blameless?" Now wait a minute, does everybody refrain from working on the Sabbath day? Jesus said there's a distinct group of people who still work on the Sabbath day, right? That is the priest of God. If you go back to Exodus chapter 29, read verses 37 and 38, here's what they did on the Sabbath day in part. 7 days, God said. 7 days thou shalt make an atonement for an altar. Now this is the offering which thou shalt make upon the altar, 2 lambs of the first year, day by day continually. If you look over at Numbers 28 and verses 9 and 10, on the Sabbath day, you had these 2 lambs, the burnt offering of every Sabbath. They also offered the continual burnt offering, and you also had a drink offering that they offered too. Here you had some guys who were working on the Sabbath day, right? They were doing that which it was not lawful to do. Were they guilty of sin? Were they violating God's law? Or should there an exception be made for this case? You see, Jesus has laid out this idea in the minds of these men. This is not just a general cover-all law, no matter what happens, that stays in effect and overrules everything else. There are some things you have to think about. There are some things that you have to take in consideration. One of them is you can do something that's unlawful on the Sabbath day and still be guiltless. That's the example of David. The second thing is you can work, if you do the right kind of work, on the Sabbath day and still be guiltless and still not be condemned by the law itself. That was the priest. Now this ties into Mark chapter 3. This is the next story, and I don't have time to read it because of time restraints this morning. But if you read verses 1 through 6, Jesus comes to this guy who has a withered hand on the Sabbath day. So here's the Jews, once again, remember they're hiding behind every grain stalk. They're spying on Jesus, and they ask him this question. They say, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? Well, Jesus, in verse 4 there of Mark chapter 3, he asks them this question. He says, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days or to do evil? To save life or to kill? So he doesn't really immediately answer their question. He just kind of asked them another question in return. He said, which is better to do on the Sabbath day, good or evil? Is it better to save life on the Sabbath day, or is it better to kill somebody on the Sabbath day? Jews wouldn't answer, They didn't know. Well, they knew. They just didn't want to say. In Matthew's account, in Matthew 12 and verses 10 through 12, he goes on to ask them this question. He says, what man shall there be among you that if he have 1 sheep, and it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? And here's his conclusion, wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath day. The question is this, could you do something good on the Sabbath day or not? Jesus says, well, what would you do if you had an animal? And this animal falls into a pit. Would you do something good for that animal, or would you say, I can't do anything for him on this day, because it's the Sabbath day, and we all know you can't work on the Sabbath day, right? If you would do something good for an animal, Jesus said, how much of more value is a man? If the law allows you to do something good for an animal on the Sabbath day, then the law of God allows for you to do something good for a man on the Sabbath day. And here's the problem. When you think about helping somebody, you think about healing, you think about saving lives, can you boil that down to a rigid schedule? I mean, can you say tomorrow at 3 o'clock, I'm going to save a life? Doesn't work like that, does it? Can you say tomorrow at 7:15 a.m., I'm going to have an opportunity to do good, and this is the good that I'm going to do? You can't reduce those things to a rigid schedule. You know what you have to do? You just have to operate, and when the opportunity arises, you have to take advantage of those opportunities. That's all Jesus was doing. It was the opportunity to heal. It was the opportunity to save life. It was an opportunity to help a man. And so he pointed out, priests work on that day. They do something that helps other people on that day. And therefore it is not a violation of the Sabbath law. Let's mention lastly, Christ's teaching on the Sabbath. Here's what he says, and I want to emphasize this too as we're talking about this point. Today, we don't live under the Sabbath law because it was part of the law of Moses. Okay, that law was taken away. It was nailed to the cross. There's some people today who say, well, the Sabbath day today is the first day of the week. No, it's not. We're not commanded not to work on the first day of the week, okay? Are there some comparisons you can draw between the two? Sure. I mean, there's always comparisons you can draw. But it's not the Sabbath law regurgitated into the New Testament, okay? So that law was fulfilled. It was done away with. And so we're studying about a different time, a different operation. But here's what Jesus said about the Sabbath. He pointed out that the Sabbath was created for man. Notice verse 27. He said the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Now that sounds like, somebody reads that and they say, what in the world is that all about? But here's basically what Jesus was saying. Which one of these things were created first? Was man created first, or was the Sabbath day created first? Which one of these was the greater of God's creation? Mankind or the establishment of the Sabbath day? You see what he's talking about here? Man came first. Man was not, it wasn't that the Sabbath law, God made this Sabbath law, and now he says, everything that I do after this is going to fall into the confines of this law. Man was made first, the law came later. And so you have this principle of something greater sometimes overrules the lesser. Jesus is talking about this idea, and it wasn't that Jesus was telling guys, you just do whatever you want to do on the Sabbath day. That's how some people read that today. Man wasn't made for the Sabbath, so that means you can do whatever you want to do on the Sabbath day. That's not what Jesus was talking about. What he was talking about is this. Sometimes there was a greater need of man that arose that took precedent over the law of the Sabbath day. Man was not made for the Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man. And if you stop and you think about it, that's really true about all the commandments that God has given us. Sometimes there's a greater need of man that arises that supersedes that law that God gave us. Now, I don't want to spend a bunch of time going into examples, but hopefully you get the idea and the grasp. And Jesus says this in Matthew 12 and verses 6 through 8. He said, if you'd known what that means, you wouldn't have condemned the guiltless. Now, we've studied all these things about the Sabbath day, and I know I said we don't live under the Sabbath day, and so you're probably sitting there saying, what are we supposed to take home from this lesson? And that's the main thing that I take away from reading these stories. If you know what these things mean, you won't condemn the guiltless. In other words, we look at the Jews and we're probably quick to condemn the Jews because we look at them and we say, they had all these petty rules, and they had all these traditions. And you can see where the law of God ends, and you can see where they start carrying things to extremes, and they start demanding things that God didn't demand, and going further and further down that road. And we can look at them And hopefully all of us can see them and say, yeah, I can see that line right there. But I want to say, don't be too quick to condemn them, because we do the very same thing today. We take these very special laws that God has given to us, and we read about the rules and we read about the regulations, the things that are acceptable, the things that are forbidden, and then we say, I think we need to clarify some things. You know, we need to carry them a little bit further, and we need to define what you can do and what you can't do. Now, I was thinking about that idea, you know, again, when I was going through this lesson, and one of the things that popped into my mind, again, the Sabbath day is not the first day of the week, but that's one of the parallels that I thought about. You know, God has given us this day, the first day of the week, and on this day, He says, here's some things that you need to do. You know what we do as men sometimes? We say, well, we need to clarify that. Or we need to carry it a little bit further, right? And so here's what we say. Sometimes on this first day of the week, you need to do those things twice. You ever hear that? Somebody said, what are you talking about? I'm talking about a Sunday morning, Sunday evening service. Now, I want to emphasize there's nothing bad about a Sunday evening service. There's a lot of things that are beneficial to them. But when do you cross the line? When do you come to the place where you do what God tells you to do, and then somebody says, no, I think we need to go a little bit further. I think we need to add this to it, or we need to take away this from it. And so there's this mindset that if you don't come to worship God 2 times on the first day of the week, you're not a faithful Christian. Is that a line we drew, or is that a line that God drew? I don't know about you, but when I come back on Sunday evening, there's some things that I don't do on Sunday evening because I've already done them Sunday morning. I've already done those things that God has commanded me to do. And so my point is this: we need to be careful that we are not drawing lines, that we're not setting up these petty regulations like the Jews were guilty of doing. Somebody says, do you have to have mid-week Bible study? Well, where's the law of God that says you do on Wednesday night? You have to assemble. It's not there, right? Now, do I say that because I don't think studying the Bible is a good thing? No. I mean, I come Sunday night and I come Wednesday night because I think it helps other people. I know it helps me. I think there are good things from it. But when do you make it a law, and when don't you make it a law? And if assembling one time during midweek and having a Bible study makes you more spiritual, what would you say about a congregation that says, well, you guys only assemble once, we assemble twice. We go on Tuesday nights, we have a Bible study, and on Thursday nights. I think if you don't do that, you're probably just not as spiritual as we are. We'd say, now wait a minute, don't carry things to extreme. We don't want to do it every night, right? But at least once a week. See what I'm trying to say? We look at these Jews and we say, man, how could they be so ridiculous in their thinking? How could they incorporate all these petty rules into this law of God that had been given to them? The point is this: let's not make rules where God hasn't made rules. And let's not look down upon somebody because they don't follow the same schedule that we might think is better for us. Jesus said the Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. The last thing that I'll mention is Jesus had command over the Sabbath. And that's what he says in verse 28. He says, therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Jesus is once again declaring his authority as God upon earth. He is the one who gave the Sabbath to man. He is the one who told man, observe the Sabbath. And so he says, if I want to tell them not to observe it, I can tell them that. If I want to tell them what to do on the Sabbath day, if I want to tell a man to take up his bed and walk, I have the authority to tell them that because I made this day and I gave it to mankind. And therefore I am Lord over this day. Men are to do exactly what Jesus told them to do on the Sabbath day. That's the point that he was making. You know, you look at all these stories, and for the Pharisees, there's only one alternative that remains. They're going to violate every tenet of their law. They're going to go against all their faith and their belief. And they're going to go to their Roman enemies and form a pact with them, the Herodians. And they're going to work together how they can come up with a plan to destroy Jesus. Friends, from this point on in the ministry of Christ, that's the shadow that looms over Jesus. We're going to kill him. We're going to destroy him. We're going to do away with him. He's going to continue to teach. He's going to continue to preach and to heal. But there's always going to be this plan that's going on, and there's always going to be this price that has been put upon his head. And so as you see Jesus going into this ministry, listen, we read about these great crowds and all these people who are going to hear him, but not everybody was in favor of Jesus. There was a lot of opposition, a lot of opportunities, but a lot of opposition that he faced too. Maybe there's one here in our audience this morning who has never become a Christian. The Lord's invitation is